ABC General Hospital spoilers reveal that the latest revelations from General Hospital have detonated like a bomb over Port Charles, confirming at last what many feared, but no one dared to say aloud. Willow committed the crime that had been blamed for months on Michael, and every lie she told to protect herself dragged Chase deeper into a spiral he can no longer escape. What began as a single impulsive decision, switching the keys, planting the evidence, insisting Michael was responsible for Drew's shooting, has grown into a catastrophe with consequences spreading far beyond the hospital halls or the Corinthos mansion. Now that the truth has surfaced, the spotlight has turned mercilessly on Chase, revealing how much he knew, how willingly he looked away, and how far he went to shield a woman whose love for him had already faded. And once the narrative shifted from suspicion to confirmation, Chase was left standing not as a victim of Willow's manipulation, but as her accomplice. The official report that exposed Willow's involvement shattered whatever fragile order Chase had managed to cling to. Investigators uncovered not only Willow's guilt, but also patterns of interference, missing records, altered statements, and small, seemingly harmless favors Chase had provided along the way, each insignificant in isolation, but together forming a chain linking him directly to her deception. It became painfully clear that Chase never needed to issue a forged statement or hide a weapon. His greatest crime was the willingness to believe Willow over logic, over evidence, and over his own moral compass. In the end, it was loyalty that condemned him. The board reviewed his actions, the department conducted its internal investigation, and the ruling came swiftly. Chase was terminated, effective immediately. The expulsion was not dignified, not softened by years of service or the respect he once commanded. It was clinical, final, and public. Watching him turn in his badge and weapon felt like witnessing the burial of the man he used to be. But losing his career was only the first fracture. The collapse of his marriage followed soon after, beginning not with a fight, but with a silence heavy enough to choke him. Brooklyn had tried to be patient, tried to believe that love could withstand even the most devastating scandals. But the revelation that Chase had chosen Willow's word over their marriage broke something fundamental inside her. It wasn't the crime itself that ended them, it was the realization that Chase had compartmentalized his loyalties, until Brooklyn was no longer the person he trusted most. And when she looked at him, she no longer saw a partner. She saw a man who could jeopardize their entire future because he could not let go of someone who had already betrayed him. The divorce papers arrived only days after Chase cleaned out his locker, and though he signed them without protest, the ink carried the weight of every moment. He failed to see how deeply he was losing her. The home they built together became hollow, echoing with the kind of absence that feels louder than any argument. The cruelest blow, however, came when the adoption agency contacted them to freeze their application. The investigation into Chase's conduct raised questions about his stability, his judgment, and his fitness to become a father. Even after the divorce, he had held on to the small flickering hope that he could still be a parent someday. That losing Brooklyn didn't also mean losing the future they had dreamed of. But institutions do not bend for heartbreak. They look at records, at risk levels, at the potential for harm. And Chase's name had become synonymous with professional disgrace. His termination, combined with his connection to Willow's crime, placed him on a list that would shadow him for years. The letter he received was polite, careful, and devastating. The agency regretted to inform him that they could not proceed with any placement, not now. Not in the foreseeable future. It was the moment he realized he had not only lost his wife, but also the family he had imagined holding in his arms. Port Charles, despite its size, became suddenly too small, too sharp, too aware. Every whispered conversation at the station, every sidelong glance at the cafe, every guarded expression from people he once called friends, worked like needles driven beneath the skin. Chase became a symbol of what happens when good men abandon their principles, not out of malice but out of misplaced love. And as Willow's confession circulated, as her motives were dissected and her guilt confirmed, Chase found himself blamed for enabling her, for amplifying the damage, for fueling a witch hunt against Michael that nearly cost an innocent man his freedom. He could no longer correct the record, could no longer make his intentions understood. Public opinion had already crystallized, and the version of Chase they hated was louder than the man he actually was. This downfall did not unfold dramatically in a single moment, but accumulated piece by piece, until the disaster became unmistakable. Every attempt Chase made to explain himself only deepened the sense that he was drowning beneath consequences he never imagined facing. The city that once trusted him now saw him as a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the strongest moral foundations can erode when feelings collide with responsibility. And yet the tragedy of Chase's collapse lies not in the mistakes he made, but in how thoroughly those mistakes have consumed everything that once gave his life meaning. As Willow prepares for her own reckoning, the narrative has shifted toward the broader fallout, toward the question of who else will be damaged before the dust settles. Chase stands at the center of that storm, stripped of uniform, home, marriage, and the promise of fatherhood. What remains is a man forced to confront the truth he avoided for too long. that loving someone is not the same as saving them, and that protecting the wrong person can destroy everything you hope to build. And if this is only the beginning of the consequences, Port Charles may soon face an even darker chapter, one where Chase's unraveling becomes the spark for an even greater disaster no one saw coming. The fallout from Willow's confirmed crime had barely settled when a new and far more explosive twist began to form, one that placed Harrison Chase directly in the crosshairs of two people he never expected to face: Brooklyn and Michael. What had started as a scandal threatening his career had now mutated into a personal war fueled by betrayal, humiliation, and the desperate need for justice. With Willow exposed and Chase identified as her accomplice, the Corinthos camp was no longer willing to sit back and allow him to disappear quietly into disgrace. Michael, once the target of Chase's obsessive pursuit, was now ready to strike back with a precision and ruthlessness Chase never believed him capable of. And Brooklyn, shattered by the realization that her entire marriage had been built on a man who prioritized another woman, found herself stepping into a role she never imagined, an avenger in her own right. What made this shift so shocking wasn't merely the revenge itself, it was how methodical, coordinated, and unrelenting it became. Michael had endured months of suspicion, scrutiny, and public doubt. He had watched his reputation fracture under accusations Chase helped orchestrate. And now that the truth was out, he refused to let Chase walk away with nothing more than a ruined career. Michael understood something Chase never expected when pushed too far. Even the quietest man can learn to weaponize his pain. So Michael began crafting a trap, a psychological snare designed to corner Chase the way Chase once tried to corner him. He started leaking selective information to the authorities, information that pointed to new inconsistencies in Chase's involvement, some true, some exaggerated, all strategically placed to create the illusion of hidden depths to Chase's betrayal. It didn't matter whether every detail was accurate. It only mattered that enough of it sounded plausible to reopen questions the department believed were settled. Brooklyn's involvement made the situation far more volatile. While Michael wanted justice, she craved something different: clarity, control, and the power to reclaim the parts of her life that Chase had shattered. The emotional wreckage of their divorce had hollowed her out, and grief quickly hardened into anger that pushed her to stand alongside Michael, not because she wanted vengeance, but because she needed to prove to herself that she was no longer the woman who made excuses for Chase. She had spent too long defending him, too long believing that love alone could stop him from spiraling into moral collapse. Now she knew better. And with that knowledge came the fierce determination to ensure Chase never hurt anyone else the way he had hurt her. Together, Michael and Brooklyn became an unlikely force, one fueled by shared betrayal, sharpened by personal pain, and guided by a sense that Chase's downfall was not yet complete. Their alliance startled Port Charles, a pairing no one predicted but everyone understood. Michael's strategic mind and Brooklyn's access to intimate details of Chase's behavior gave them an edge he could never have anticipated. Slowly, quietly, they built a case that framed Chase not just as Willow's enabler but as someone who had actively manipulated investigations, falsified timelines, and concealed evidence. Some of their claims danced dangerously close to fabrication, but both knew that in the court of public opinion, perception could devastate faster than proof. Chase felt the walls closing in before he even realized who was behind the tightening grip. Rumors began spreading that he had acted far more aggressively in Willow's case than initially reported. Old disciplinary marks resurfaced seemingly out of nowhere. Former colleagues grew distant, wary, unsure of what was true anymore. Chase tried to push back, but the backlash had gained momentum, becoming something wild and uncontrollable. Every attempt to defend himself only made him look guiltier, more desperate, more trapped in the shadow of Willow's betrayal. When Chase finally confronted Michael, it was already too late. Michael's calm, cold dismissal confirmed everything. This wasn't retaliation born from emotion, it was strategy, calculated and deliberate. Chase had spent months trying to destroy Michael's life using the justice system as his weapon. Now the blade had turned back on him with devastating symmetry. But the true blow came when Chase realized Brooklyn was part of it. Seeing the resolve in her eyes, the absence of the warmth that once defined their connection, struck him with a force greater than any legal threat. She wasn't acting out of spite, she was acting out of survival. Chase had become a danger to her future, and she was now choosing to protect the version of herself she almost lost while loving him. The escalation was unstoppable. The department's review board reopened his case. New complaints were filed. Old allies stepped away, and the adoption agency's final rejection landed like a stone sinking into the last unbroken part of his spirit. Chase was being dismantled piece by piece, not through violence, not through scandal, but through a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to ensure he could not rebuild his life on the same shaky moral ground again. The shock rippled across Port Charles with a brutality no one predicted. What had seemed like the end of Chase's story, the exposure, the firing, the divorce, was merely the prelude. The real collapse was happening now, engineered by two people who once cared for him deeply, but who now saw him as a threat to themselves and others. Michael's trap was tightening, Brooklyn's resolve was hardening, and Chase's grip on his identity was fracturing. And as the dust began to swirl again, one undeniable truth emerged. This was not the final explosion. It was only the spark. Something far more catastrophic was building beneath the surface, and when it erupted, it would consume far more than just Chase. The whispers coming from the set of General Hospital have ignited a storm that is now spilling directly into the Femins. Storyline: Josh Swickard is reportedly preparing to exit the show, and the writing is already shifting into a darker, more tragic direction for Harrison Chase. What once seemed like a temporary downfall is transforming into something far more permanent and unraveling, so catastrophic that it feels less like a storyline and more like the slow erasure of a man who once represented hope, loyalty, and quiet strength. With the confirmation of Willow's crime and Chase's involvement as her accomplice, the writers have begun guiding him toward a fate that feels chillingly final. As though every scene is building toward an ending he cannot escape. Chase's life has already collapsed by the time the news spreads he has lost his badge. His marriage has dissolved into distant silence, and every dream he ever held, becoming a father, reclaiming purpose, proving his worth, has shattered at his feet. But now, with Josh Swickard's departure looming, the creative team appears determined to push Chase to the edge of a narrative abyss. The missteps, the guilt, the humiliation, the betrayal, they are no longer just consequences. They are symptoms of a slow internal decay that is spiraling towards something irreversible. Chase has become a ghost in his own story, wandering through Port Charles with the weight of a future that has already been taken from him. The tragedy is not only in what Chase has lost, but in what he begins to fear about himself. The accusations, the public shame, the way Michael and Brooklyn have turned against him, with strategic precision, all of it has carved deep wounds into a man who once believed he could hold everything together with discipline and moral clarity. Now he is haunted by a sense that the city no longer wants him. That every place he once stood with pride now recoils from his presence. His departure from the police force was just the first breaking point. The real fracture is happening inside, where doubt and despair are slowly rewriting his identity. And this is where the storyline becomes truly unsettling. Chase begins to realize that he is no longer fighting to clear his name. He is fighting to remember who he was before the world collapsed around him. The writers are leaning into this psychological unraveling, crafting scenes that show him drifting through moments of silence, staring at old photographs, replaying his failures until they sound like confessions. Port Charles has become a landscape of reminders, every street corner, every familiar voice. Every mention of Willow or Michael or Brooklyn deepens the ache of what he cannot repair. The tragedy is not loud. It is suffocatingly quiet. As the narrative accelerates toward Josh Swickard's exit, there is a growing sense that Chase's final chapter will not be defined by redemption, but by resignation. The man who once fought tirelessly for justice is now trapped inside the consequences of choosing the wrong battle. His fate is written in shadows, an ending shaped not by a single mistake, but by the slow erosion of everything he valued. The show is preparing viewers for a goodbye that feels more like mourning. A farewell steeped in the haunting realization that some characters do not fall, they fade. And as this storyline gains momentum, one thing becomes clear: Chase's departure will not close the book. It will open a new one filled with suspicion, grief, and unfinished emotional wreckage for those he leaves behind. Willow's guilt will deepen. Brooklyn's pain will sharpen. Michael's anger will harden into something cold and unyielding. And Port Charles itself will feel the echo of Chase's absence, like a wound that refuses to heal. Because when a character like Chase falls, he does not fall alone. He leaves behind a silence that becomes an obsession, and an obsession that becomes the next great disaster.